Welcome back to another episode. In early January 2026, nationwide protests erupted across Iran, initially sparked by the economic hardship, corruption, and political grievances, and rapidly grew into a broad anti-government demonstrations challenging the critical leadership and its legitimacy. Iranian authorities responded with an extremely heavy militarized crackdown, including the use of live ammunition, mass shootings, nighttime curfews, and sweeping arbitrary detentions. And they imposed a near total internet and communications blackout that has hindered the independent reporting and the documentation of the events. Human rights organizations and activist groups estimated that thousands of protesters have been killed, and the figures varying widely due to the information blackout. Credible tallies from the civil society monitors indicate more than 6,000 deaths and tens of thousands of arrests, while the human rights activist news agency reported that 7,000 deaths, and some unofficial sources at the UN experts believe toll could be far higher. So they are subject to mistreatment, torture, and forced confessions, while security forces have cracked down on the wounded protesters in hospitals and harassed families of the deceased, sometimes withholding their bodies or pressuring the relatives to make false statements. The Iranian government has justified its actions by branding demonstrators as terrorists and criminals, signaling harsh punishment for dissent and framing the unrest as a security threat aimed to be crushed. Even as the United Nations Human Rights Council passed a resolution condemning the killings and the internet shutdown, and global solidarity rallies in cities such as Munich and Toronto, due to hundreds of thousands calling for international pressures on Tehran. The intensifying crackdown has preceded deep domestic and geopolitical ripples effect. The fear generated by surveillance and mass arrests has disrupted universities, workplaces, and civil institutions. They push civil society networks underground and entrench polarization as the economic pressures compound the public anger and grief. Intentionally scrutiny from foreign governments and bodies such as the United Nations has strained the diplomatic channels already burdened by nuclear negotiations, while diaspora communities amplify advocacy through demonstrations and lobbying, keeping the attention fixed on the alleged abuses as the confrontation drags on and is prolonged. Worsening inflation and unemployment in stressing essential sectors such as healthcare and education, with ordinary citizens facing shortages, rising costs, and uncertainty about safety. At the institutional level, sustained unrest risks reshaping international power dynamics as the security services assume a more prominent role in a political faction. Debate responses that might avoid uncontrolled escalation, yet analysts warn that the extended reliance on force can create feedback loops in which the repression fuels further resistance and narrows the space for reform. If the current trajectory persists, however, observers foresee a protracted period of intellectual protest waves, tightened state control, and an ongoing humanitarian strain that could influence regional stability, migration patterns, and the global economic tides, underscoring that the crisis represents not only an immediate security emergency, but a structural political test likely to shape our country's trajectory for years to come. In conclusion, the unfolding crisis in Iran represents far more than a temporary wave of unrest. It is a coverage of political grievance, economic strain, and the human rights confrontations that has escalated into a defining test of state authority and social resistance. The government's forceful crackdown has suppressed visible dissent in some areas, but has also deepened domestic polarization, which has intensified the international scrutiny and raised serious concerns about the long-term stability and humanitarian consequences. Actions and condemnations from bodies such as the United Nations highlighted the global stakes, yet the durable resolution ultimately depends on internal dynamics and whether the pathways emerge for the accountability and reform and dialogue, or whether cycles of repression and resistance continue to reinforce one another. The direction Iran takes in the coming months will likely shape not only domestic political future, but also its regional relationships and global standing, which makes the current momentum a critical inflection point with consequences that may extend for years. I want to thank you again for watching another episode of the Political Lens podcast, and until the next video, have a good day. Thank you.